Hi, book fighters. It's Thursday, June 30th, and, I've been lied to. Alright, sorry I missed last week. I had a bunch of stuff come up during the day, and it sort of wiped out all of the time that I had for making a video. I think I was only home for like a half an hour during the day, and then I didn't get back till like 3 in the morning, so that happened. I apologize, but I'm here now to talk about books and what have you. The one that I read this week that I'm not going to talk about much is the Saga of the Volsungs, Saga of the Volsungs. It's also called Volsunga Saga, and it's Norse mythology. I'm a huge fan of Norse mythology. I think that it's the best mythology, and I think Saga of the Volsungs is better than Beowulf, which is sort of like the pinnacle of Norse mythology in a lot of people's eyes, though I prefer the Poetic Edda even further up than this one. I think that it's just a lot more sort of in touch with the state of humanity than a lot of mythologies are. It's not so much preachy. I mean, it's a little preachy, as mythologies kind of tend to be, but I think that it's a lot more real. For me, it's a lot more tangible and accessible than Greek mythology or Roman or Welsh or any of the other popular mythologies out there. So yes, I think this is really interesting. It's pretty short, so if you're looking for a mythology to read, this is the one I would recommend. But that's what I'm going to say about this one, because I want to spend most of my time talking about The Great Gatsby. So The Great Gatsby is the book for the Nerdfighter Blurbing Book Club, and I know Lauren and Dan are also reading it, so I'm looking forward to their videos. Now, as we've done this project, I've gone and reread a few books that I read in high school, and every time that I've read them, I've felt that they were completely different books than what I was told that they were when I originally studied them in the high school class. I went back and I took things away from it, important things away from it that I didn't get when I learned them in high school, and I feel like a lot of the interpretations that we've been told in high school don't do justice to the book, and there's sort of like a squint-eyed interpretation of it that sort of has an assumed bias just going into it. And that I feel most strongly with The Great Gatsby, because what did we learn that The Great Gatsby was about in high school? The American dream, right? It's about the American dream and how it's ultimately unattainable, and also I was told that this had heavy moral overtones about how drinking and sleeping around and what have you were all bad, and it was just a very, like, condescending sort of book, I think. I mean, I enjoyed it when I read it the first time, but I think that that was because I was taking things away from it that we didn't learn in class. And those are the things that I think are ultimately more important and more accurate, because I don't think this book is a commentary on alcoholism or the American dream, which leads to another question. Maybe Dan can answer this. Dan, if you can answer this when you talk about this book, I would love you for it, because I've been curious. I think of The Great Gatsby is a very American book, very American, like quintessential American book, in sort of the same category as Death of a Salesman and Mice and Men. And I am just curious that if you don't live in America, what do they tell you that these books are about? And maybe it's just because I was taught that it's about the American dream, is that I think of it as such an American book. But I just want to know, like, what is the perspective that you guys get out of it? Because it's probably not about the American dream if you read this in school and you don't live in America. So that's what I want to know from Dan. What were you told about this? What is the perception of this book in places other than the United States? Now, I can certainly see the parallels that people have made between Paper Towns and The Great Gatsby. I didn't when I read Paper Towns, because I had sort of forgotten the specifics of The Great Gatsby, and I'd been told it was about the American dream and all of those things, which is sort of what I carried with it after the fact. But now that I've read it, I can see the parallels and how people were saying that this was like a modern Great Gatsby, because they do deal with a lot of similar ideas, though I think that perhaps the ultimate conclusion of those ideas are different, because I feel like Paper Towns is a very romanticized version of The Great Gatsby. It has those sort of romantic, comedic, in the literary sense, not in the humor sense, sort of sensibilities to it. Like, you come away from Paper Towns with a certain fuzziness, right? So, like, there was a certain sense of loss, but at the same time, you come away with the perception that things can be changed, and we just need to sort of change the way that we look at people and the way we think about people. Whereas The Great Gatsby, I think, is much closer to Catcher in the Rye in the sense that it's like, this is something that we do, and we build up images of ourselves and ideas of other people that supersede human capacity, and it's just what we're all going to do. It's what we all always will do, and that it is ultimately tragic, but it's a state of being. Like, we're stuck with it. Like, not so much in the nihilistic sense, which is kind of how it's coming out when I'm talking about it, but I think that Paper Towns tells you this is how you deal with it. This is how you adapt to it. Here's how you come to a place where you don't do that anymore, or you don't think that way about, you don't do that to yourself anymore, those sorts of things. Whereas I think The Great Gatsby says that it's an observation. It's a recognition of the state of affairs. Like, this is the human condition. I think that dichotomy goes even further because ultimately none of the characters in this book are likable. None of them are likable. And in Paper Towns, you come away from it that everybody's likable in their own way, whereas The Great Gatsby says nobody is likable. The things that we like about ourselves and other people are ideas more so than who they are. So I think the conclusions are different. I think the ideas are the same, but what is taken away from those ideas are very different things. Another thing that I want to bring up about the sterilization and sort of bias of high school literary study. There is a scene in this book where Nick Carraway goes to a party, gets drunk, and then goes and hooks up with a dude. If you're reading this version of it, it's pages 37 and 38, the very end of chapter 2. And in high school, I didn't even notice that it was in there. Nobody else noticed that it was in there. Nobody brought it up. Nobody talked about it. And I'm not trying to say that this is any sort of like queer literary piece, or that it necessitates any sort of queer theory reading to it necessarily, but the fact that we didn't even see it, we didn't even acknowledge that it was there, which seems like the type of thing that would be brought up by somebody, at least somebody in the class. And I think that a lot of us, when we read the scene, because it is not explicit, because it doesn't have them doing anything explicitly in the text of the book, we read it and didn't really understand what was going on, but didn't think about it any further, because it doesn't really have any consequences in the story itself. It's just sort of like, this happened, that's there. Take that as you will. And so we just sort of forgot about it because we didn't understand it when we read it, so we just went on. And I don't know, I think that we get these ideas that the people writing these books are these sort of paragons of virtue and very conservative people, and as you get into literature more, I think that you find less and less that that's the case. And I think that's certainly not the case with The Great Gatsby. Like, this whole spiel about how it's a criticism of alcohol and indulgent lifestyle, I think is not the case either. Like, yeah, there's all that stuff in here, but it's props. It's meaningless things that make meaningful things happen. But it's not ultimately a commentary on those things. They're just devices to tell the story. They're just the setting. They're just how you create it. And I think that that's interesting. And I think that it's that idea that these are all very straight-laced and moral books that we read in high school that teach you how to do the right thing is why a lot of people don't like literature, why they don't continue to read, why they hate their English classes. It's kind of like my poetry rant from my last video, but I think that the way that we get taught things in high school makes us hate them. and I have a different rant for each subject for why that is. But for literature specifically, I think we get told that these are the stories that we are told. And for me, like in high school, I thought pretty much all the authors we were reading were dead, unless they said otherwise. I just assumed they were all dead. And that was that. And so for me, when the author of The Catcher in the Rye died, I was like, what? He was still alive? And it's a surprise every time I find out that one of these authors is still living, because for me, they're all dead. And they all wrote these so long ago, they're not even relevant to me anymore. And I think that stems directly from the way that I was taught these books. Similarly, when we're told that they're moral stories and very conservative and have these very dry ideas, we can't relate to them, we can't connect to them because we feel condescended to. And so that's why teenagers can't get into these books, because they're not allowed to look at them in a way that makes them applicable to their lives. And I think that's a disservice to the books themselves, and I think that is a disservice to the teenagers that are being taught them. And so I just have major problems with this. I only had one teacher that didn't do this crap to me when we studied it, and that was my sophomore English teacher, Miss Highland. We're friends on Facebook. And she's the only one. She was by far the best teacher that I ever had for English in high school, because I felt connected to the stories in a way that I never did before. So yeah, I didn't mean to rant quite so much in quite the same way that I did last week, but there it is. I would really like to hear Dan's and Lauren's and later John's perspective of this book. Because I think it'll be interesting. I'm really excited to have this sort of discussion. We haven't really all read the same book since The Hunger Games, and so I'm excited to do that again. It would be really cool if Sarah and Julia read it too. Not that you have to, but it would be cool if you did, because then we could all talk about it. So my question for you this week has to do with my rant. Have you gone back? I know this maybe doesn't apply so much for Julia because you just graduated high school, but have you ever gone back and reread books that you had been taught in a class before, sort of your own volition? And did you have this similar experience that I did with going back to The Great Gatsby in a separate piece and those other books that I read once in high school? This same feeling that you were lied to by your English professors? Or what was your experience when you've gone back to these things? Okay, this video has gone on long enough, so Julia, I will see you tomorrow.